With it being the 30th anniversary of Nirvana's final studio album In Utero this week, I thought it would be a good time to take a look at the history of the album. Personally, I've always liked the album better than Nevermind. Nirvana would hit mainstream success in 1991 thanks to their second record, Nevermind. The album, of course, was also instrumental in helping bring Seattle bands to the forefront of mainstream rock, although I want to point out that Alice in Chains were really the first grunge band to have a gold record with their 1990 debut album, Facelift, and Soundgarden was the first of the Big Four to nab a major recording contract. While Nevermind arguably made Nirvana one of the biggest bands in the world, many were left asking where could they go next. For the record label DGC, they thought that Nirvana would follow up Nevermind with basically another Nevermind. But they would be sorely mistaken. Their first clue was who Nirvana chose as their producer, which was Steve Albini, who was well known for his disdain of the corporate music industry and his unvarnished approach in recording bands. Bassist Chris Novoselic would tell an interviewer, "I don't think the label were behind it, but we'd sold enough records to do whatever the hell we wanted." The making of In Utero is really a story about a band wanting to reject what appealed to the masses and going back to their punk roots, while at the same time questioning themselves and compromising. Drummer Dave Grohl would tell Rolling Stone on In Utero's 20th anniversary, "There are a few ways you can look at it. You can describe it as a remarkable achievement. You can also remember it as a really f***ed up time." It was following the release of Nevermind that frontman Kurt Cobain made it clear in interviews that he wasn't happy with the sound of the record, feeling that it was too polished. In one interview, he referred to it as, and I quote, "candy ass," while in another, he was quoted as saying, "I'm embarrassed by it now. It's closer to a Motley Crue record than it is a punk record." However, I want to point out that Nevermind producer Butch Vig would say in a 2011 interview that Nirvana and himself, and I quote, "loved Nevermind when it was done." It was in October of 1992 that the band would work with producer Jack Endino on instrumental tracks for some songs including Dumb, and it was a few months after that when the band was in Brazil in January that they did another session with Craig Montgomery where they mostly did instrumental tracks for a number of songs including Heart-Shaped Box, Scentless Apprentice, Milk It, and Very Ape to name a few. A month later, the band would be back in America with Steve Albini, this time in the middle of winter in rural Minnesota at Pachyderm Studios to start recording In Utero. Albini had chosen the studio to ensure that the band wasn't distracted by outside vices and influences, including shutting out anybody from the band's label. Given the remote nature of the studio, there really wasn't much else to do than focus on getting the record finished, and it would be done in just 2 weeks. However, Albini did use some of the downtime to prank call Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, a band that the media loved to pit against Nirvana. Albini would pretend to be David Bowie producer Tony Visconti, telling the Pearl Jam frontman he'd love to produce a solo record, but Vedder claimed at the time he wasn't interested. Cobain had been a big fan of Albini's, repeatedly praising his work on the Breeders record Pod and Pixies record Surfer Rosa. Funny enough, Albini wasn't a fan of Nirvana at first, admitting to an interviewer, and I quote, "It wasn't the sort of stuff that appealed to me." Admittedly, he had never seen the band live and only really knew of Nirvana through MTV. Ahead of accepting the gig, Albini would send Nirvana a letter outlining the conditions that he would take the job under, one of which was that he would not accept royalties on the record, something that was pretty customary in the music industry. Instead, he would take a flat fee of $100,000. Had he opted to take a royalty, he would have made upwards of $500,000. But Albini didn't think it was ethical and thought it was, and I quote, "an insult to the artist." But years later, Albini would talk to Kerrang! Magazine and claimed he could have worked on the album for free. He would tell the publication that he offered to wager his salary over a game of pool. If Nirvana beat him, he'd work for free, and if he won, they'd have to pay him $200,000 to produce the record. Albini would tell the publication, "I did that with every band I worked with, and no one ever took me up on the offer. It's not like I'm a particularly good pool player, but I have an equal chance of winning in a fair game." But I guess Nirvana were a little more risk-averse than I was. In Utero would see a more collaborative effort between the members as Kurt Cobain was the principal songwriter in the band. But on the track Scentless Apprentice, Dave Grohl came up with the guitar riff and Kurt agreed to work on the song. The band would also record the Grohl-penned song Marigold, which he'd do vocals on, and while it wouldn't make the album, it would be released as a B-side to the first single Heart-Shaped Box. Upon completing the record, Nirvana would hand in the album to their label, but there were problems. The execs at DGC anticipated a record in the same vein as Nevermind. Instead, they got a much less polished album. There was lots of reporting in the spring and summer of 1993 that the label thought the album was so bad that they threatened not to even release it. Even by April of 1993, numerous press outlets, including the Chicago Tribune, published an article with the title that read, and I quote, "Record label finds little bliss in Nirvana's latest." Albini would recall to Louder Sound what was going on around this time. After they finished, those frightened little people started trying to influence them, tried very hard to convince them they made a mistake and the record wasn't actually good. When that didn't work, they mounted a kind of campaign to smear the record in the press, to put additional pressure on the band to change their minds. I know this because I was getting the brunt of the complaints, and I was hearing as much from journalists who called me for comment. The pressure from the label seemed to at least have the band questioning themselves. Cobain would tell an interviewer, "The first time I played it at home, I knew there was something wrong. The whole first week I wasn't really interested in listening to it at all, and that usually doesn't happen." The band soon concluded that they weren't happy with how the album was mixed. They soon enlisted REM producer Scott Litt to remix the planned singles to make them more radio-friendly. It was a move that initially upset Albini, who refused to hand over the tapes, but finally relented. The album opens with the song Serve the Servants, with the fitting opening line, "Teenage angst has paid off well, now I'm bored and old," a reference to Cobain's sudden rise in fame, while the song also attacks the press over their treatment of his wife Courtney Love, with the line, "If she floats, then she's not a witch like we had thought." In Utero's lyrical themes tackle what Cobain had dealt with over the last several years of his life, in addition to sickness and health-related themes as well. The album would only have 2 charting songs in Heart-Shaped Box and All Apologies. There was a third single planned for release with Penny Royalty, but due to the death of Cobain in 1994, it was scrapped. However, the label had already sent Penny Royalty to some markets, and between 200 to 400 of those singles actually found themselves in the hands of fans. You can actually still find them on eBay selling for supposedly hundreds of dollars. Penny Royalty would get an official release in 2014 on Record Store Day. The first single, Heart-Shaped Box, would peak at number 1 on the alternative airplay charts and number 4 on the mainstream rock chart. The band would also release a video for the song, and it would be directed by Anton Corbijn. In a strange twist, the band would be sued by their former director Kevin Kerslake, allegedly stealing the video idea for Heart-Shaped Box. I've done a whole video on the lawsuit, the link is down below. Heart-Shaped Box's video would go on to win the MTV Music Video Award for Best Alternative Video, but by the time the award was given to them, Kurt Cobain had died and Nirvana was finished. The album itself would top the album charts, selling 180,000 copies in its first week out, and going on to be certified 5 times platinum. However, the band would run into issues with some of the big box retailers like Kmart and Walmart, who initially refused to stock the album because of one song. Because this is YouTube, I probably can't say the song name, but they would reissue the album with the song being retitled Waif Me. The tour to support In Utero would be hampered by Cobain's persistent health issues and had to be cut short when the frontman was hospitalized in Italy in March of 1994 after taking a deadly combination of alcohol and sedatives. It was a month later he'd be found dead in his home in Seattle, and Nirvana would disband. Drummer Dave Grohl would look back on the album in 2021, admitting that he still struggles to listen to the record, as obviously it represented a very dark time for the band, going on to say, and I quote, "It makes my skin crawl." I want to know from you guys, how do you feel about In Utero 30 years later, and how does it compare to Nevermind? Let me know in the comment section below, and as always, if you have suggestions for future topics you'd like to see on our channel, use the link in the description box below, and we'll see you again on Rock and Roll True Stories.